The third one is around adaptive planning. So again, we talked about sandboxing and renewable energy, but actually we need to skill up. We need to build the coping capacity of communities to this rapid change. And having the density of communities, whether they're high density, medium density, low density, we've got a lot of people in a small amount of space. That's part of the definition of cities. And so as places for innovation, for building social networks and social capital, they're a really great opportunity.
Are you interested in resilience as bouncing forward? What do you think about city sandboxing? How can we increase our adaptive capacity as individuals, communities, and cities? Stay tuned for answers from Sam Kernaghan.
What is the future for cities? Do you want to learn more about them? Do you want to know how others think about them? Do you want to be part of the conversation? Then this is the right place.
Welcome to What is the Future for Cities podcast. Today, I will interview Sam Kernaghan, Director for the Resilience Program at the Committee for Sydney. We will talk about his vision for the future of cities, data and decision-making, resilience, experimentation, urban energy, and many more. So let's start with a proper introduction. Over the past 25 years, Sam Kernaghan has worked with the UN, Rockefeller Foundation, and Asian Development Bank to design and deliver climate-focused investment programs with governments and urban communities around the world. Since volunteering in post-tsunami Sri Lanka in 2006, Sam has worked with more than 50 cities across Asia, New Zealand, Australia, and the US to build resilience to growing natural hazard risk and changing economic and social shocks and stresses. At the Committee for Sydney, an independent urban policy think tank, Sam established the Resilience Program in 2021, creating a respected research and advocacy platform that has built capacity and influenced policy change across decarbonisation, nature-positive, and climate adaptation priorities. Sam is a non-executive director of Green Cross Australia, a fellow and climate champion at the Planning Institute of Australia, and a lecturer in Sustainable Futures at Western Sydney University. And with that, Sam, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for your time. I highly appreciate your opinions on the podcast. Let's jump right in. What does the future of cities mean to you?
Hi, Fanny. Thank you very much for having me on the podcast. I'm excited to be here. I think when we're talking about the future of cities, I think we need to start with why cities are important. And I think it was only 2007 that the world flipped from being predominantly rural to predominantly urban. And in my career, that's relatively recent. But given the first city was perhaps created 7,000 years ago, it's actually a very recent occurrence. Here in Australia, we're 85% urbanised. So the fact that we're talking about cities is pretty obvious. But Australia as an urbanised country, again, only flipped from predominantly urban to rural in about 1944. So cities are becoming a big topic of conversation. But I think there's a wider context here, right? So the process of cities becoming important is defined by urbanisation. So that's people and capital kind of accruing in a place. And urbanisation is important in this conversation. But there's other things that need to be considered when we're thinking about the future of cities. And so that's urbanisation. So that's where we've come from, but also the increasing urbanisation of our countries, our economies, our places. Again, these are pretty standard terms, but I think it's important to understand that the decisions that are happening in our cities, the lives that we're leading, are more and more influenced by what's happening in other cities around the world and other countries around the world. So that's important. The digitalization is a kind of third component of that. 2007 was the invention of the iPhone that kind of put a computer in everybody's hands. And so that's leading to, again, an expectation, I think, that our cities are more and more data-driven. But also with that computer in your hands, you're expecting to be able to make decisions within cities that you have more power over, more agency. And I think my whole career, I've always had people telling us that we're going to be able to develop digital models of exactly how cities are going to work and grow and design. And I've never seen one yet, but it's still promising. And the fourth one is then climate change. And the reason we need to talk about climate change, and I want to talk about climate change a lot in this conversation, is both the energy transition, particularly here, the shift to renewable energy and the kind of just transition and the need for equity in that transition. But the opportunities that creates are significant. There's also the flip side, which is the risk that climate change is creating, the hazard risk, but also this urbanization of risk, right? And that's two things. One is we're putting more and more people density into areas that might be flood liable or exposed to extreme heat or coastal risk. There's those elements to it, but also an increased dependency on infrastructure. So whether that's water or energy, you've got more and more people who are reliant on those urban systems, those infrastructure systems functioning, because if they don't work, and with the changing hazard risk, there's increasing chance of disruption. More and more people are then at the other end of not being able to access those basic needs. So what does the future of cities mean to me? All those things coming together into people, communities, households, neighbours, living and working and trying to thrive in the context of all this change. And one of the things that I think about a lot is around this kind of adaptive capacity or capacity to cope or ability to evolve and change as humans, as communities, in the context of all this other stuff that's happening around us and the speed at which that is accelerating.
Before we move on to the individual elements of your vision for the future of cities, I would love to create a baseline because you mentioned many aspects, but I would love to understand, what does the city mean to you?
What does the city mean to me? I think the word is vibrancy, I guess, for me. And that's vibrancy not just in a cultural sense, but in interactions between a density of people and access to not just economic opportunity, but cultural opportunity and different experiences. I remember I used to live in Bangkok for 4 years, and Bangkok is the only real 24-hour city that I've experienced. I'm sure there's many more, but that's the only one that there's still bars on the street at 8 o'clock in the morning, pop-up bars on the street as you're going to work. It fully overlaps throughout the day, throughout the year, and it's just hugely vibrant. There's so much going on. Not every city goes that full 24-hour loop, but that vibrancy, that access to, whether it's, as I said, cultural opportunities, nightlife, but also things during the day, places to go. That's the diversity and access to opportunity culturally, economically, socially. I think that's the thing that really defines cities for me.
Thank you very much for the description, because then I can feel that there is a distinction between a city and a town for you. I'm not sure whether there is a very clear line between these two, but you mentioned Bangkok. I assume the smaller habitats are a bit different and you wouldn't say those are cities for you.
I think it's defined by the vibrancy more than the size. Yes, Bangkok's probably an extreme example, but I've lived in London, Bangkok, Singapore, Sydney. I've done lots of work in New York and Manila. Those places have all got different experiences of vibrancy, and some big cities, big places don't have that vibrancy. It's a lot about the density, but I think for me, what's exciting about cities, where the places you want to go is where there's that cultural experience and density of human interaction.
It comes clear that you differentiate the different places based on vibrancy. I would love to go back to one specific aspect you mentioned regarding digitalization for the future of cities, because you said that with digitalization, we are achieving data-driven decision-making, which gives us the opportunity to have more agency and more power around our environment and our life. I'm curious, does data-driven decision-making make our agency and our empowerment easier in your experience?
I think what I'm talking about is, and maybe it's just the ability to plan trips on your phone and the data that enables you to do that. So bringing that information into APIs or platforms that allow you to look at what the different options are. Those are really a huge advantage to people living in cities and looking at what's going on and the real-time kind of updates you can get. I think the bigger promise of smart cities and data-driven decision-making about how we plan and design our cities, I think that promise has not been realised. I think there's a lot of sensor networks and smart city stuff that's been talked about for a long time that I really just don't think has been realised in terms of the collection of that data and how it actually leads to better decision-making. So there's lots of data being collected, but the drive seems to have been, let's collect lots of data and then work out what we're going to do with it. And again, it's a personal view, There's still a big community of people focusing on collecting that data. But that kind of bigger smart city thing, I haven't seen it. Where I have seen data-driven, maybe not decision-making yet, but data informing really important decisions or really important research to inform decisions is around microclimate here in Sydney. So we have the Bureau of Meteorology that has weather stations across the city that are measuring heat, but there's not enough of them. They're not to be able to differentiate between the microclimates across a suburb, let alone across places like Western Sydney. And there's been research been ongoing from Western Sydney University particularly, where a local government area will have hundreds of little monitors that are developed and deployed across the local government area. And through a whole summer, they will take hourly measurements of what's happening across the local government area. And so that tells you then where your hottest and coolest parts of the local government area or suburb are. And then you can look at why. Is it close to water? Is it close to prevailing breezes? Is there a density of green space or nature? Where are those real heat hotspots that mean that in summer we're getting measured temperatures over 50 degrees in parts of Western Sydney? And so that kind of data is hugely important to inform decision making. But as yet, that's relatively new and it's providing the platform to then enable decision making. Still hasn't yet, I don't think, made the transition to, okay, so what do we need to do with that? How do we build the green corridors? How do we improve cooling in different places? It's definitely informing thinking and policy, but there's a long way to go, I think.
There is a research group and advisory engineering group in Sydney. They have been researching how, with precision irrigation, they can lower the urban heat island effect to temperatures, not just in the park, which they are irrigating, but 2 to 5 kilometers from the park, decreasing the temperature by 2 to 2.5 degrees, which is fascinating. And for example, they would use this kind of data.
It's the same group. It's Sebastian Fouch at Western Sydney University doing that kind of heat-based research. And that's, as you say, using irrigation, using evaporation and transpiration as the basis for cooling suburbs beyond and using prevailing wind patterns, when to irrigate, when to water. I guess my point is we're still at the research stage, right? There's really great research going on. And it's something that we probably know, right? When I lived in Singapore, you'd go bike riding and you'd be really hot and then you'd go past one of the big kind of national parks. You'd feel the temperature drop 2, 3, 4 degrees. It's not proving that we can cool areas beyond, but it's showing actually how would you deploy the technology. As I say, this research is really cutting edge. It's brilliant. It's emerging. But how you get that to the scale where irrigation across the city is actually leading to of neighbourhoods that don't have that access or bringing temperatures down is something I would love to see us get to. I should add, if going down that path, not only Sydney, but Sydney is sort of a hotspot of deep research on extreme heat. So we have Uni New South Wales who's doing amazing work on kind of the buildings technology, how you design and small and large buildings particularly so that they minimise heat. And they're not just here in Australia, but all over the world. Got a real centre of excellence for that. And then at University of Sydney, there's the Heat Health Research Centre, which focuses on human health. So particularly we know the technology they use through the Australian Open tennis, where they're using their technology to determine when it's too hot for players to play tennis. And that informs, it's not just tennis, but that's the way we know because we play the Australian Open at the hottest time of the year. So there's data being used to inform decision-making around personal health, which is great on a sporting platform. And that kind of informs sport and outside play here in Sydney and I'm sure across other parts of Australia. But again, that's about human health, which is really important, particularly in extreme heat. Is that informing urban design? Is that informing how we just think about the structure of our cities? Not yet, I don't think.
Which is a bummer. I would love to understand then, what does smart city mean to you?
I think smart cities, exactly as you defined it earlier, which is using data to inform decision making. It's not about the collecting of the data. So it's smart governance, if you like. It's actually connecting the data to decision making rather than the collecting of the data. And I guess that's my, if you like, critique is we're very good at collecting the data and we have lots of smart people with lots of good widgets who can collect lots of data. But how is that actually informing decision making? Particularly if you think about the way cities are structured, the urban design, if you like, we're planting trees, where we're doing that irrigation, where we're informing people about where the heat risk is. I think it's taking that data and actually leading it into personal, but also wider planning and design decision making. And the more I think about this, the more examples come into my head of how that is starting to happen. But I think the measurement and the data collection still far outweighs the translation into decision-making.
Would individual decision-making processes create a smart city? I'm curious because we could talk about smart lighting, smart bins, smart irrigation system, which individually could be really good, but questionable whether it would create a smart city.
I think it comes back to what is a smart city? What are we trying to achieve here? And I think for me, a city that's able to, it's not even a city, it's the people, right? It's the people having agency over their own decision-making that is by that data. And the city in itself is not smart. I think that's the vision. A smart city, as we talked about it, is something that has lots of sensors and lots of data being collected. But actually the smartness comes in the human ability to interact with that data, to benefit from it in their own decisions. I guess that's the thing, enabling human agency over how you can respond to that data, whether that's around air quality or temperature or traffic accidents or whatever it is. That's where it becomes useful.
I'm also curious because we have been mentioning technology and data collection, data analytics. What does technology mean to you? We could say that technology is just the digital technology. While in my conversations, that seems a bit too of a narrow approach, because we could say that smart cities are the ones which are using technologies for better decision-making, for better life for people. People are using technologies to create better decisions and better lives for themselves. But is technology just the digital part, which we are very focusing on right now? Or are there other parts of technology which we could come back to and also appreciate? For me, I would talk about a wider understanding of technology. So for me, technology means applied knowledge. For example, putting a park in a city to decrease the urban heat island effect, that's a technology. That's a good application of human knowledge to create better lives.
If we're thinking about technology as applied knowledge, which probably isn't how I would have thought about it, but if we're thinking about applied knowledge, it completely changes the frame around how we're thinking about our cities. One of the things that immediately springs to mind at the complete other end of the scale, if you like, is the use of cultural or cool burning, which is applying Indigenous knowledge of fire management or bushfire management across Australia, but also across Sydney, versus the Western approach, which is a much newer approach and a much more brutal approach to how we do backburning, which is literally about removing what they call the fuel, the sort of leftover dead bits of wood and things that are on the ground. The Indigenous approach to fire management is a much slower, cooler fires, which they respect the wildlife at a temperature and a speed at which wildlife and the fauna can all escape and find a new home, but it's also at a temperature which encourages the regeneration of those locations. I guess reflecting tens of thousands of years of knowledge of how to interact with the flora and fauna of our country. It's a knowledge that has been carried through and is being slowly, increasingly applied as a bushfire management technology. So it's very different into the, if we're going to use the word technology for applied knowledge, then you've got completely different ways of thinking about how knowledge is applied. I guess if you went a different way, like one of the things we've talked about, I've done a lot of work on urban resilience, which is the way I talk about that is the way in which cities can survive and thrive in the face of shocks and stresses. And that's not my definition. That comes from the Rockefeller Foundation's 100 Resilient Cities program. But one of the things, the applied knowledge, there's a whole range of different areas in that, but it comes down to the idea of neighbours knowing neighbours, right? So it's network building effectively. It's social networks, which are the key to any kind of disruption. And we've seen this recent examples of the Northern Rivers where there was massive disruption, massive floods. And the response to that was not just the Tini Army, people using the assets that they have to go and rescue people, but also community getting together to bring food, bring shelter, open up their doors. So you're building a kind of social network, if you like, whether that to some degree that has to exist before, to some degree that grows in the event of a disruption. But it's not a technology in the way we think about applying a particular thing to a problem, if you like, but it's an applied knowledge, which is so much research backs this up. The more social connections, the language around bridges and bridging and bonding connections goes back to social capital language. They're the communities that best survive and thrive in the face of those major disruptions because they've built that connection, they've built that knowledge between them. And that's one of the hardest things, I think, around building hazard or disaster resilience is how you do that in the face of a future challenge. If you've had a disaster, if you've had a major hazard event or major shock, then often the community is brought together around that event. It's to what extent you had the cultural connections, the social enabling environment that built those connections prior. And that's where you see that strength coming through. And it's not just here in Australia. There's all kinds of examples from around the world. I think there was an example from the heat wave in New York in the early 2000s where there was literally 2 apartment blocks, a couple of 100 metres apart from each other, and they had very different levels of morbidity. And literally one of them had a community group that checked on each other and brought water and brought food and whatever. And the other one, people just lived their individual lives. And you're just in the wash up. It's like, as I said, one had a much higher level of morbidity and they just didn't have the same level of connection and social capital in that building. To say it's not, I don't know, breaking it down to what technology is, but that knowledge of who's who, where they live, what they need, checking on them, knowing who's got what, borrowing stuff, that kind of, it's pretty old school, but it's a way of building that social capital and community.
I'm glad you took the turn to resilience because that was the next question I wanted to discuss. And you described resilience as systems, cities, communities which can survive and thrive on shocks. Now, I'm curious about this description because in my understanding, resilience is bouncing back to the original level and surviving the shock. For me, that's a bit of a lacking term because I think that it's not enough for systems to just survive the shocks. I think they need to thrive and learn from the shocks and become better for the shocks. And I thought that the term which describes this kind of behavior is anti-fragility, not resilience.
I think the research or the theory around resilience has gone into different ways. And certainly one shorthand for resilience has been bouncing back. But the way we always used it is more about bouncing forward from a socio-ecological background. If you're taking a socio-ecological approach to resilience and applying that into urban systems, this goes back to research a couple of decades ago. I would say very hard or almost impossible to actually return to a previous state because things have changed. A visual of this is a reed blowing in the wind and the wind blows the reed and it sways in the wind and then comes back to where it was. Okay, that's fine. But in a city, if you have a flood, you can have a heat wave, you can have a whatever it is, you have a disruption, the event has happened and you've started to go through your recovery. The people have changed. Not only have they grown older, but they've had that experience and therefore they have changed themselves. The infrastructure may have been damaged and therefore needs to be rebuilt. Not always, but hopefully there's been some learning about how that infrastructure has failed and therefore it's been improved as a result. We can always hope. But even maybe the level of preparedness that community takes away as a result is now we know that's a level of shock that we can experience and what the impact of that is, and therefore we can change. We can prepare differently, and the local government that's responsible and the not-for-profits and the emergency response. As a city, you can't go back to where you were. It's not actually possible. Yes, you could have a bridge that is knocked down and the bridge could be replaced exactly as it was. And that happens, and that generally doesn't work out very well because it's generally lost the next time you have exactly the same flood. But as an urban system, which we're talking about cities, easier than saying urban systems, you can't actually bounce back to where you were. There's lots of different diagrams around this. You may not recover sufficient to where you were because of the level of investment or because the level of the shock meant that your financial capacity has meant that your reserves are lower. As a community, you've lost some infrastructure and that hasn't been replaced or it's still to be replaced. The recovery process, as I say, in theory, is a bouncing forward. It's an opportunity for investment, an opportunity to return to a place that's better than before for all kinds of good reasons. That's not necessarily the case, but it does create the opportunity for bouncing forward. Again, we've talked about the infrastructure, but there's also the previously used sort of 3 I's. One is around information or knowledge that we talked about. So you have new information about a particular experience or a particular hazard risk or something you might have experienced something you'd never had before. But there's also, as I said, the institutions, the organisations, whether it's businesses, whether it's community groups, whether it's government, they've all kind of, again, experienced that event. And we are talking about shocks here, but they can also be stresses. Go down the COVID route as a major stress. And there's a huge amount of learning that happened out of that. Now, some people's behaviour doesn't change as a result of those things. You go back to exactly as you were before, your personal behaviours, but the system has changed. You can't go back to where you were, as I said, for lots of good reasons. So my version, when I talk about resilience and the way we've used it with Rockefeller Foundation, with the 100 Resilient Cities program that I worked on, it was never about bouncing back. It was about recognising that you've got this complexity and you're preparing that complex system for an uncertain future, and also in response to shocks and stresses, how that system, that community, that place can bounce forward.
I love this bouncing forward. I've never heard of it. So thank you so much for describing this.
I'm just not taking credit for this.
I understand, but still, it's really good that you mentioned. Now, there was another term you used in your original answer for the future of cities, equity. What does equity mean to you?
It's a good question. And I think, again, this is not my quote, but I heard somebody say at a conference that equity means fairness to some people and it means to banks that they own it. So you have equity in something is an ownership stake. And whereas equity from a fairness perspective, i.e. everyone has an opportunity to take advantage of the opportunities that cities provide or don't have that same opportunity. So it's really around fairness and opportunity to me. I'm sure there's much better definitions of this, but you can work through lots of different versions of this. One is a kind of postcode equity. So in cities, we've tried to get away from this, but where you're born, where you grow up determines your health outcomes or your economic opportunity, things like that. And while there isn't places like Sydney, there's not like a big divide that says if you're on this side of a line, particularly, you have these outcomes. But to some degree, there also is. If you grow up in a particular postcode, you have different economic opportunities, you have different hazard risks, etc. You have different insurance prices, you have different access to things like renewable energy potentially, and you definitely have different access to higher paid jobs depending on which industry you're in. And you definitely have longer travel times. And so there's a spatial equity, I think, that is really important to be considered in cities. So that's one element of it. We shouldn't say obviously, but there is a gender equity element to cities, which is important. We talk about kind of spatial leash. So that concept's about how far women can travel from their home, particularly when they have kids, because of how long the childcare goes for or how far away they're in case the school calls and they come back. And it's not only women, but it's largely women. And so how comfortable they are to go if they're a long way from the CBD to travel to those roles if there's dependents that are relying on them. But that has a real gender equity element across, in Sydney, but certainly in Sydney, not just Sydney. And things like working from home, as an example, was a real benefit to that, to unlocking that spatial leash to some degree. Gave particularly women, but not just women, also people with other kind of mobility challenges or other limitations, if you like, to be able to travel. Huge improvements. The kind of shift away from work from home then reintroduces an inequity in access to opportunities, economic opportunities, work opportunities. And so I think when I talk about equity in cities and thinking about that as a real priority, it's ensuring that we're not just designing our cities or thinking about our cities in the way that they attract global capital and global talent. Yes, that's really important because that creates the investment and that creates some of the buzz and the vibrancy that I talked about before. But if you're only designing and creating your policy frameworks around attracting global talent and global capital, you're potentially forgetting about a whole swathe of your population, of your community, of your inhabitants who are not connected to that benefit, to that investment. I think putting that equity lens on all of the ways we think about policy and investment and design and planning within the city.
Just to clarify, equity for you is equal access to opportunities, not outcomes.
Yeah, I think it's access to opportunity.
I'm asking this because, again, equity can mean so many things with so many people. Yeah. And also you mentioned spatial equity, which equal access to opportunities sounds really cool. But you also mentioned globalization and how cities are globalizing. And also in my conversations, mainly architects, urban planners, engineers, urban designers complain about how cities lose their character because of globalization. However, if we want to have spatial equity, that means that cities will lose this kind of character because everywhere we would need to have the same access to opportunities, to food, to jobs, to healthcare, to education, to whatever. how can we create spatial equity with still preserving the character, still preserving the culture at that spot? And please correct me if I have some misunderstanding in this question.
Oh, I'm not saying that we need to take a cookie cutter approach to all of our cities and everything needs to look and feel and be exactly the same. Yes, there's going to be a spectrum. Not everybody has the same level of education. Not everybody has the same training and opportunity to actually apply for every job. Not everybody's going to live within 20 metres of a park, etc. Some people are going to be 500 metres. But I think within that realm, we're saying we need to put that lens over our decision making. We're not just designing cities, or we're not just focusing our cities for, if you like, the big end of town for that wealthy, for that investment set. But I think one of the things places like Sydney are really trying to focus on is thinking about polycentricity. So you don't just have one CBD. You're actually designing your city so that there are other hubs. And again, not every job is going to be available in each of those smaller centres. That's not possible. It's an approach rather than you talked about the outcome where every single person has exactly the same. No, that's impossible. But only designing so that you're leaving behind significant parts of your population is not, I think it's good for the whole city, but it's also not a good design or planning principle.
We have been touching upon these ones. What are the three biggest fears or concerns regarding the future of cities for you?
One is loss of nature. We rely on nature for cooling, as we've already talked about. We rely on it for mental health. This is just of humans, for social interaction, but we also rely on it for so much more from a biodiversity and cultural heritage perspective. And we're not doing a very good job here in Australia of maintaining or preserving or enhancing our natural environment, and particularly our biodiversity. So that is number one. The second one, we talked a little bit about this adaptive capacity of communities. So the rate of change of a hazard environment, and it's not just natural hazard risk, but that's certainly one of them, adaptive capacity, coping capacity of our communities, but also our infrastructure, of our businesses, of our government institutions for those major events, but also the smaller ones that have come along, the kind of shocks and stresses that come with a changing climate. There's a huge human capacity to that, and the impact on people and the environment, but on people from those rapid changes. It's here. It's not coming. It's here. Linked to that is then the economic side, which talked a little bit about the cost of insurance. So again, this goes a little bit to postcodes, but it also just goes to the equity component. Insurance is not the biggest cost that people face, but it is definitely, if you're in a high-risk area, your insurance might be beyond what you can pay. And that's certainly starting to happen in our cities. And so we've seen that in the US and the UK. That has a major impact on households, families' ability to buy an asset, whether that's a home, but it also has a flow-on effect, I think, in terms of the financial systems. If you can't get insurance, then you can't get a mortgage. And that's only, of our population has mortgages, so it's only 30%, but it's still quite a big population who are facing a kind of risk to that kind of standard financial system of being able to access debt. Staying on the economy theme, extreme heat has a major impact on productivity and cost to households. This is research that we did. Extreme heat's costing Western Sydney alone, so half of Sydney, $1.4 billion a year just in cooling costs, health costs and lost productivity today. But that's not as the temperature increases going forward. And so existing economic costs are significant. But further to that, this is going to New South Wales. The New South Wales government's investing $4 billion in disaster recovery over the next 4 years. Last year, they put down another $4 billion just to rebuild the roads from the recent floods. So there's a huge amount, like literally billions of dollars that are being put into fixing roads and fixing other bits of infrastructure and helping communities recover, relocate houses and things like that, which is all important in a post-disaster environment. But it means that there's a huge amount of money that is not productive. It's not being put to adaptive capacity. It's not being put to schools and hospitals. It's not being put to a whole lot of things. And so it's taken a huge amount of money out of the spending capacity, if you like, of our current governments, which we rely on for a lot of that social infrastructure. If you play those challenges forward, they're my biggest fears. You're actually degrading your environmental systems, your social systems, and your economic system. That was pretty bleak, wasn't it?
Such a pretty picture. Let's turn to the other side of this same coin. What are the three biggest opportunities regarding the future of cities for you?
So we just did a piece of work at the Committee for Sydney called Sydney as a Renewable Energy Zone. And one of the data points that emerged from that was that if we put rooftop solar on every roof across the city, we could actually meet 75% of the city's energy needs with renewable energy. Obviously, you would need battery storage to shift that to other parts of the day when energy is needed. But it shows the huge potential for cities to meet their own energy needs, or a large proportion of them, and reduce the amount of energy we need from the big generators or from outside of the city. Now, that's a theoretical number. The real number of what's actually possible with capacity factors and other things the engineers tell me about means the number's going to be lower. That's fine. But it shows that there's a huge opportunity not just to generate here, but also to improve the access of business, small business, large business, and households, owners, renters, social housing to the cheapest form of energy that we have. And the buildings upon which that infrastructure, that renewable energy would be located, are already built. We don't need to go and build this infrastructure. We don't need a new zone. We don't need a new planning structure. We don't need to go and build a whole bunch of stuff. It's already there. Again, engineers will tell you all the reasons why that's difficult, but there's a huge opportunity there that we're currently not taking advantage of. And we pat ourselves on the back a little bit that we're like, we've got 25 or 30% of our rooftops have solar on, and that's world leading. And it is, and we should be very proud of that, but it's not enough. There's just more opportunity. So that's the first one. The second one is cities are great at sandboxing, at testing things. We've got so many different contexts. We've got so many different types of communities. We've got so many different environments that we can test, whether it's energy or get to the adaptive planning, but ways of solving some of these problems or challenges, these opportunities. And so this kind of test and scale model that is necessary to solve these issues, some of these big challenges we've been talking about, cities are the perfect place to do that because you've got lots of different environments. You've got lots of different opportunities. You've got willingness. You've got capital. You've got smart people. And we just need to, again, get on with it. So sandboxing, it's just a fancy way of saying trying stuff, proving it and scaling it. But we have amazing universities. We have great research. We have really world-leading businesses, investors, etc. Like we just have the smarts and we have the places and we have the contexts. The third one is around adaptive planning. So again, we talked about sandboxing and renewable energy, but actually we need to skill up. We need to build the coping capacity of communities to this rapid change. And having the density of communities, whether they're high density, medium density, low density, we've got a lot of people in a small amount of space. That's part of the definition of cities. And so as places for innovation, for building social networks and social capital, they're a really great opportunity.
Sam, you have been very generous with your time and answers, and I could ask you for hours, for example, what is the government's role in establishing the future of cities, but I want to be respectful of your afternoon. So what is your role in establishing the future of cities?
My role is as a connector. I think the complexity of what we're trying to deal with in cities means that we need as many platforms, opportunities to bring together the different knowledge, the different perspectives, the different interests, the different risk appetites from across the city into lots of platforms, forums, opportunities to connect those ideas and perspectives, but in a way that is productive, in a way that is useful, and in a way that is understanding, refining, clarifying what the challenges are and how different people see them and how different businesses see them and how different parts of government see them. And then collectively and collaboratively working out what's the outcome, what's the vision that we're trying to get to, where are we trying to go with these challenges, and then work out how to get there. It's fascinating. It sounds really simple in concept. I think what's been hugely revealing to me, and I've played this role in different organisations, is that done well, you enable the different parts of the system to see each other. It's not just business and community. It's not just government and community or different layers of government. People bring their own knowledge, their own perspectives, their own positions, their own values to every conversation, to every issue. And only by hearing and discussing and thinking through how each other is approaching and experiencing this issue, and then hearing how they might take a different steps to solve it, is the only way, in my experience, that you actually get to a really positive plan, strategy, but also then a way of actually solving stuff. Because when you come up with that result, whether that's a plan or a strategy, it's been bought into or it's been co-designed by a whole range of different stakeholders from across the system. And you need to be really intentional in who is engaged, involved. And it's not perfect. It's never perfect. And there's always more voices you can hear. There's always more time. But if you're able to host, not just in workshops, not just in big design forums, but also public discussions, closed room discussions, different ways of eliciting the perspectives and the solutions, for me, that's the thing that I've seen is what's needed. Sometimes we call it the glue. You need to be able to glue the different pieces of the system together in order to. That doesn't mean everybody always agrees. In fact, that rarely happens that everybody always agrees or ever agrees. But by being in the same process together, that's how you get progress. And being able to then present that way forward to those with the power to actually implement. And that might be business, that might be local government, that might be a senior minister with funding. So that presenting a plan to then be implemented. But along the way, you've built a cohort of people who understand and can take into their own roles, because everybody has an ability to influence their own organisations and the way that organisation's shaped and delivers and interacts and partners. And sometimes we end up with a plan that doesn't get implemented, but lots of the groups that were involved have created their own partnerships and have gone off and worked out a way of delivering stuff together that moves the problem forward or moves that solution forward. I was going to say it's ongoing, but it's unlimited. And that's why I say it's not just my organisation that does this. There's lots of different organisations that do it. But we're very clear that our goal in the role that I have currently is about improving the future of the city. It's not about advancing the business interest or advancing the community interest at the cost of the wider outcome of the city. And if I step back through the work that I've done with the 100 Resilient Cities or with the Rockefeller Foundation or with the Asian Development Bank or in consulting roles, it's always been about trying to create those platforms where you can enable those discussions, enable those different perspectives, take the ego out of the room, because that's where I've seen success. That's where I've seen changes in policy, in investment levels, in the way in which programs are designed and delivered to actually deliver that intended change on the ground.
Sam, thank you so much for your work, because this connecting role, this glue is freaking important. And I can understand that for collaboration, we do need that, even if it's not everybody is coming along nicely and playing nicely, someone kicking and screaming. But still, that could be collaboration because of that connector role. Thank you so much for your time today as well and your answers. Do you have any closing comments or requests for the audience?
Two things. So one, we didn't touch on the difference between resilience and sustainability. We talked about resilience. We talked about it's the ability to manage shocks and stresses, the ability to bounce forward. There's so much more to it than that. Sustainability is the constrained resource environment that we live in. We don't have any more resources. So where the resilience is about managing shocks and stresses within a constrained resource environment, whether that's we need to manage our energy, our waste, all of those components. It's way more complicated than that, but that's the simple environment where you're trying to manage both of those things together, and they're very connected, but they're definitely different in my mind. The second thing, and this is my message to myself when we're thinking about these challenges, but also to your audience, is to think about who owns the risk. So literally who owns the financial liability for the impacts of a hazard event, for a disruption to a piece of infrastructure, to a loss of nature, who owns the risk? And it sounds simplistic maybe, because you might think, oh, it's an asset owner or it's a bank or it's one. But it's not true. Different people in a heat wave, the ownership of personal risk sits with an individual. The ownership of the wider risk might sit with the emergency responders. The ownership of the ongoing risk might sit with a local government or a community who is not supported. It sounds like a negative way of approaching an issue, but it's actually really important because, again, my experience is the ownership of the risk or the liability is the thing that's actually holding us back from making the progress. And as we unlock that, if we understand that, if we keep asking that question of who owns the risk and understanding, that will help us to address this urgent challenge of not only energy transition, but also addressing climate risk.
Thank you so much.
It was really interesting to hear from Sam about how resilience is bouncing forward instead of backwards. Not to mention his description of cities as experimental places. Karina Gormley, in episode 298, advocated for more allowance in governments for experiments to fail, thus learn. You can find out more about Sam online. All the links are in the show notes. What was the most interesting part for you? What questions did arise regarding Sam's approach to the future of cities? What have you learned from this interview? Let me know on Twitter at WTF4Cities or on the WTF4Cities.com website where the transcript and show notes are available. You can also subscribe on the website not to miss any new episodes and leave some feedback. I hope this was an interesting interview for you as well, and thanks for tuning in.
What is the Future for Cities podcast?